So in the previous video, I was talking about how the beneficiary principle is perhaps one description of trust law. However, I think there is perhaps a better principle that can legitimately claim to provide a better description of trust law than the beneficiary principle, and that is the enforceability principle. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the enforceability principle holds that a trust can be valid only if there is someone to enforce it. And so the beneficiary principle says that a trust is only valid if there is a beneficiary, whereas the enforceability principle says something completely different. It is saying a trust is only valid if there is someone to enforce it. Okay? A trust is enforced when trustees' duties are enforced against them in court. So what the enforceability principle is dictating then, that a trust is only valid if there is someone who can take the trustees to court in the event of a breach or suspected breach of their duty. So judicial support. As with the second version of the beneficiary principle, which I talked about the two different versions of the beneficiary principle in a previous video, so do check that out if you don't know those two different versions of the beneficiary principle. So as with the second version of the beneficiary principle, there are various judicial statements supporting the enforceability principle as a description of our law. Okay? So we got this from Morris and Bishop of Durham from 1804. There must be somebody in whose favour the court can decree performance. So there must be someone who they can sue. And we've also got from Riastor in 1952, a trustee would not be expected to be subject to an equitable obligation unless there was somebody who could enforce a correlative equitable right. Okay? So Riastor said a court of equity does not recognise as valid a trust which it cannot enforce. So let's map the enforceability principle with the state of the law to see how well it describes our law. Trust with beneficiaries, so that's both in the narrow and wide sense of the word, as I described in the previous videos, comply with the enforceability principle. Okay, they are enforced by their beneficiaries. So beneficiaries of a trust, whereas whether of a fixed or discretionary trust, can bring their trustees to court in the event of a maladministration. So when a trust has a beneficiary, it also has someone who can enforce it. So trusts with beneficiaries obviously comply with the enforceability principle. But of course, this doesn't take us any further than the beneficiary principle did. The real issue is whether the enforceability principle can deal with purpose trusts in a way in which the beneficiary principle could not. And I talked about purpose trusts as well in my previous video. Okay? So importantly, the enforceability principle can also accommodate some categories of legally valid purpose trusts. So the reason why the enforceability principle has a claim to more accurately describing our law is because it can also accommodate some categories of legally valid purpose trusts. This is something which neither version of the beneficiary principle could accommodate. Okay? So enforcing charitable and re-denly trusts. Charitable trusts comply with the enforceability principle. They are enforced by the Attorney General and Charity Commission. So firstly, the enforceability principle can account for charitable trusts, which is something that neither beneficiary principle can do. There is someone who can enforce a charitable trust, so we've got the Attorney General and the Charity Commission who can bring trustees to court where maladministration is suspected. Re-denly purpose trusts comply with the enforceability principle. They are enforced by those persons benefited by the purpose. We have this quote from Goff, which says, I think there may be a purpose or object trust, the carrying out of which would benefit an individual or individuals, where that benefit, if so indirect or intangible, or which is otherwise so framed as not to give those persons any locus standi to apply to the court to enforce the trust. The present is not, in my judgment, of that character. Okay, so the enforceability principle can also account for the existence of re-denly charitable trusts. Okay, they can also be enforced by the person benefiting from the purpose. Enforcing miscellaneous non-charitable purpose trusts. So the category of miscellaneous non-charitable purpose trusts does not comply with the enforceability principle. Such trusts are not fully enforceable as it is only the remainder man who has standing to sue the trustee. So this category of purpose trust does not comply with the enforceability principle, as it is only the remainder man who has standing to sue. Now, a remainder man is the person who is entitled to any sums remaining after the achievement of the purpose. So, say the miscellaneous non-charitable purpose trust is one for the maintenance of a particular animal, which falls under this category, as we've seen in a previous video. A settler might settle £200,000 for the purpose of maintaining a particular animal and direct any money left over after that purpose has been fulfilled to go to his daughter. Okay, the daughter here would be the remainder man. So the remainder man is the person who gets any money which remains after the fulfillment of the purpose. The law tells us a remainder man is indeed entitled to enforce these miscellaneous non-charitable purpose trusts. So, for example, in the above example here, the daughter can indeed take the trustees to court, so even where there has been maladministration, okay, and they will clearly wish to enforce if the trustee, for example, wrongfully reduces the trust fund by overspending on the purpose. So in the case of this, so in this particular example then, the daughter will have an incentive to enforce it if it was felt that the trustees are overspending on the maintenance of the animal to their detriment. But the remainder man will have no incentive to enforce it if the trustee underspends on the purpose in question, because this will maximise the amount which will remain and therefore be directed to them. So we can see that this category of purpose trust does not have a proper enforcer. So it is not properly enforceable in the way demanded by the enforceability principle. In other words, the remainder man can enforce, but they won't have the incentive to do so. So enforceability mapped against our law. Given the legal validity of miscellaneous non-charitable purpose trusts, the enforceability principle is not a fully accurate description of our law. So the enforceability principle cannot describe our law perfectly, yet it provides a more accurate description of the law than does the beneficiary principle. Okay? So the enforceability principle is able to capture two of the three categories of purpose trust that I described in the previous video, which is something that the beneficiary principle simply does not do. Better then, I think, to assert the enforceability principle and acknowledge miscellaneous non-charitable purpose trust as one exception to it, than it is to probably assert the beneficiary principle subject to far more substantial caveats that it cannot accommodate the existence of any type of legally valid purpose trust. Now, not everyone would agree with this view, but this is my particular opinion, and I would recommend you having a think about what you think is a better principle to uphold, whether it's the enforceability principle or the beneficiary principle. So yeah, have a little think about that and write comments below to let me know what you think. But anyway, if you enjoyed the video, then make sure you give a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and I shall see you in the next one.